Friends, thank you for being here today. What if I told you that the recession everyone is bracing for has already been canceled, but only for one group of people? What if the invisible hand that will keep their paychecks flowing, their towns thriving, and their future secure isn't the free market at all, but something far more powerful? The Pentagon? We are standing at the edge of a structural shift so profound that most people won't understand it until it's too late. This isn't about market cycles or consumer confidence. This is about war chests, geopolitical fault lines, and the quiet militarization of an entire industry. And it's happening right now in the frozen north of Canada, where the new gold isn't gold at all. It's lithium, uranium, and cobalt, the minerals that don't go into jewelry, they go into missiles. Let me be precise. In late 2025, the Canadian government did something extraordinary. They designated specific mining projects as national interest and national security infrastructure. That language matters because what that means in plain English is that these are no longer just commercial operations, they are defense assets. And with that designation came something staggering: access to a $6.4 billion investment package explicitly tied to NATO's Critical Minerals Production Alliance. This is the arsenal of democracy, and it's being built in Northern Ontario and Quebec. Here's the part nobody expects. While the rest of the economy is bracing for contraction, while tech companies are laying off workers, while retail is struggling, while the housing market teeters, there is one sector that has been handed a golden ticket, not because of demand from consumers, not because of innovation or productivity, but because the Department of Defense, both in the United States and Canada, has decided it cannot afford to lose access to these materials ever. This is vanishing in real time. The old economic rules, where recessions hit everyone equally, where market forces decide winners and losers, those rules are being rewritten. What we are witnessing is the emergence of what I call the khaki economy, growth driven not by iPhones or electric cars, but by rearmament, by the quiet, relentless machinery of military procurement. And if you are in a mining town that sits on lithium, cobalt, or uranium, you are inside the vault. Everyone else is outside watching the door close. Let me show you what actually happened. To understand why this is a mathematical inevitability, we need to go back to the genesis of this crisis, not to 2025, not even to 2020, but to 1994, when China began its quiet, methodical campaign to corner the global market on critical minerals, while the West was celebrating the peace dividend of the Cold War's end, while we were outsourcing manufacturing and shutting down mines in the name of efficiency. China was buying up mines in Africa, South America, and Central Asia. They were building the refineries, they were training the engineers, they were constructing piece by piece a monopoly so complete that today they control 70 to 90% of the global processing capacity for the minerals that make modern weapons possible. Let's cut through the noise. Here's what that means in practice. Gallium and germanium, two obscure elements most people have never heard of, are essential for semiconductors in fighter jets and radar systems. In 2023, China announced export restrictions on both. Overnight, the West realized it had no plan B. Cobalt, used in batteries for everything from drones to submarines, is refined almost entirely in China. Rare earth elements, critical for precision-guided munitions, are 90% controlled by Chinese supply chains. This isn't a trade issue. This is a national security nightmare. And this is where the crack that becomes an earthquake begins to form, because the West, and specifically NATO, looked at this situation and understood something fundamental. In a conflict with China, the supply of minerals could be turned off like a faucet. The F-35 fighter jet, the backbone of NATO air superiority, requires 920 pounds of rare earth elements per plane. The Virginia-class submarine requires over 9,000 pounds of specialized alloys. If China stops exporting, the assembly lines stop, the weapon systems go dark, the alliance collapses. Here's the part they never put in the official reports. The response to this threat is not diplomatic. It is not about tariffs or trade agreements. It is about building a parallel supply chain, what they call friend shoring, where every ounce of critical material comes from an ally. And there is only one NATO country with the geology to replace China's dominance: Canada. This part isn't a prediction, it's math. Canada produces 10 of the 12 minerals that NATO has designated as defense critical. We have the lithium belts in Quebec. We have the cobalt deposits in Ontario. We have uranium in Saskatchewan. We have the rare earths in the Northwest Territories. The Canadian Shield, that ancient slab of bedrock that covers half the country, is sitting on the raw materials for the next century of warfare. And the governments on both sides of the border have decided that this cannot remain in the ground. But once this shifts, everything above it starts to shake, because what we are seeing is not just a mining boom, it is a reindustrialization of the North. Roads are being built into regions that have been inaccessible for generations. Power lines are being strung across tundra. Entire towns are being planned around deposits that don't even have names yet. This is the Arctic Economic and Security Corridor Initiative, and it is being funded not by venture capital or private equity, but by the state, by defense budgets, by the understanding that this is infrastructure for war. Let me show you the mechanism. The United States has invoked the Defense Production Act to directly fund Canadian mining projects. This is the same legal framework that was used during World War II to commandeer factories and convert them to military production. It gives the government the power to prioritize defense contracts, to fast-track approvals, to guarantee prices, and it is being used right now to secure cobalt and graphite supplies from Canadian mines. The Pentagon is writing checks, not to Tesla, not to Apple, but to mining companies in Northern Ontario. Here's what that looks like on the ground. If you work in a designated critical mineral mine, your paycheck is no longer dependent on the price of lithium on the spot market. It is underwritten by a government contract, an offtake agreement in the industry jargon. The government agrees to buy the output at a fixed price for a fixed term, regardless of what happens in the broader economy. This is the forever customer. The Department of Defense does not care if there is a recession. It does not care if consumer demand collapses. It needs the minerals, and it will pay. This is not theoretical. It's observable. The $6.4 billion investment package is already flowing. In Northern Ontario, the Ring of Fire, a massive chromite and nickel deposit that has sat undeveloped for over a decade, is suddenly being fast-tracked. Roads that were deemed economically unviable in 2020 are now being built. In Quebec, lithium projects that couldn't secure financing 2 years ago are now fully funded. The capital is not coming from banks. It is coming from sovereign wealth, from defense budgets, from the recognition that these are not just mines, they are strategic assets. And this part has already begun. The government is moving to create a domestic critical mineral stockpile. This is not a market mechanism. This is central planning. The government will buy minerals, lithium, cobalt, rare earths, and store them in warehouses, not because there is immediate demand, but because in a crisis they need to ensure availability. This creates artificial demand. It creates a price floor. It means that even if the global economy collapses, even if China floods the market with cheap supply to undercut Western producers, the Canadian government will keep buying. This is the stockpile strategy, and it is the ultimate insurance policy for the mining sector. Let's zoom out. What we are witnessing is the return of strategic resource economics. For the last 30 years, the West has operated under the assumption that minerals are commodities, that they can be bought and sold on open markets, that supply chains are global and interchangeable. That assumption is dead. We are now in an era where resources are weapons, where access to lithium is a matter of national survival, where the country that controls the mines controls the future. This is where the first domino falls. Because if mining becomes a strategic sector, if it is insulated from economic downturns by government contracts, then the old rules of regional development no longer apply. A mining town in Northern Ontario is no longer subject to the boom and bust cycle of commodity prices. It is recession proof, not because of market forces, but because it has been designated as essential to national defense. This leads us to the system's most crucial secret, which we will explore in a moment. But first, we need to understand the scale of what is being built. This is not a few isolated projects. This is a transformation of the Canadian North. The infrastructure being built, the roads, the power grids, the ports, is what the government calls dual-use infrastructure. It serves the mines today, but it can serve the military tomorrow. Roads that carry ore can carry tanks. Power lines that feed smelters can power radar stations. This is the architecture of a militarized economy, and it is being constructed in plain sight. We don't have months. This is happening in days, because what I'm about to show you is the part where the abstract becomes concrete, where the policy becomes reality, and where the economic shelter that is being built for one group of people becomes visible to everyone else. And here is where the cascade becomes unstoppable. Let me be precise about what is actually at stake here. This is not about creating jobs. This is not about economic development in the traditional sense. This is about NATO looking at its vulnerability and realizing that the entire Western military apparatus could be neutralized not by missiles, not by cyber attacks, but by a simple decision in Beijing to stop exporting processed minerals. The alliance that has defined global security for 75 years is built on a foundation of Chinese supply chains, and that foundation is cracking. Here's the detail even analysts tend to miss. When we talk about China's dominance in critical minerals, we're not just talking about mining. China doesn't have the world's largest deposits of most of these materials. What they have is the refining capacity. They took the raw ore from mines in Congo, Australia, Chile, everywhere, and they built the factories to turn it into usable material. They have 90% of the world's rare earth refining capacity. They process 70% of the world's cobalt. They produce 80% of the world's battery-grade lithium. The ore might come from a dozen countries, but it all flows through China to become something the defense industry can actually use. And this is where common sense actually becomes your enemy, because the logical response, the one that seems obvious, is to just build more refineries in the West, set up the processing plants in Canada or the United States, buy the raw materials globally, and break the dependency. But here's the counterintuitive reality. That doesn't solve the problem, because in a conflict scenario, China doesn't just control the refineries. They control the mines that feed those refineries through investment, through contracts, through strategic partnerships that were signed decades ago when nobody was paying attention. What I call the big secret of the entire system is this. China has spent 30 years building leverage that cannot be unwound in 5 years or even 10. They own equity stakes in lithium mines in Australia. They have exclusive processing contracts with cobalt mines in the Democratic Republic of Congo. They have long-term supply agreements with rare earth producers in Burma and Vietnam. Even if the West builds the refining capacity tomorrow, the raw material still has to flow through Chinese-controlled choke points to get there. This is a default in all but name, a structural dependency that looks like trade but functions like tribute. This is vanishing in real time. The window to build a truly independent supply chain, one where the West controls both the mines and the processing, is measured in years, not decades. And the only way to do it is to go vertical, to own the entire chain from the rock in the ground to the refined material in the factory. And the only place in the NATO alliance with both the geology and the political stability to do that at scale is Canada. Let me show you what actually happened when the Pentagon ran the numbers. In 2023, the Department of Defense commissioned a classified study on supply chain vulnerabilities in weapons systems. The unclassified summary, released in early 2024, was stark. It concluded that in a sustained conflict with China, U.S. weapons production would face critical shortages within 6 months. Not because of technology, not because of labor, but because the supply of processed minerals would dry up. The F-35 production line would slow. The missile stockpiles couldn't be replenished. The electromagnetic warfare systems would lack the rare earth magnets they require. The war would be lost not on the battlefield, but in the supply chain. And here's where everything changes, because that study didn't just identify the problem, it identified the solution. Canada. The report specifically named Northern Ontario's cobalt belt, Quebec's lithium deposits, and Saskatchewan's uranium reserves as strategic assets of critical importance to Allied defense readiness. That language was not academic, it was operational. Within months, the Defense Production Act funding began flowing north across the border. But that's not the real problem. The real problem is that even with this investment, even with the fast tracking and the guaranteed contracts, we are still years away from production at scale. The mines that are being funded today won't reach full output until 2027, 2028, maybe 2030. The refineries that need to be built are massive industrial complexes that take half a decade to construct. And during that window, the dependency on China remains total. This is the moment small businesses get crushed, or rather, this is the moment when the economy splits into two tiers. There is the strategic sector, the one receiving government support, guaranteed contracts, and infrastructure investment. And then there is everyone else, the companies that depend on consumer spending, on discretionary income, on the confidence that comes from economic growth. Those businesses are facing a recession. But the strategic sector, it's entering a supercycle. Here's the part nobody expects. This boom is not being driven by market demand. It's being driven by fear, by the recognition that the West is in a resource Cold War and losing. And when you are fighting a Cold War, you don't worry about return on investment. You worry about survival. The $6.4 billion that Canada has committed is just the beginning. The United States is preparing to deploy tens of billions more through the Defense Production Act, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, and direct Pentagon procurement. This is the mobilization, and it has a single target: decouple from China before it's too late. Let's cut through the noise and talk about what this means for the actual communities where this is happening. The Ring of Fire in Northern Ontario is a chromite deposit roughly the size of Manhattan, sitting 500 kilometers north of the nearest major town. For over a decade, It sat undeveloped because the infrastructure didn't exist. No roads, no power, no way to get the ore out economically. Every mining company that looked at it did the math and walked away. It was a resource, but not an asset. But once this shifts, everything above it starts to shake because the ring of fire is no longer being evaluated on commercial terms. It is being evaluated on strategic terms. Chromite is used to make stainless steel, which is essential for military vehicles, naval vessels, and armor plating. In a conflict, you cannot import it from China or Russia. You need a domestic source. And so the roads are being built, not by mining companies, but by the government under the Arctic Economic and Security Corridor Initiative. The power lines are being strung. The environmental impact assessments that took years are now taking months. This is dual-use infrastructure, and it is being constructed at the speed of national security. For the average household in a place like Timmins, Ontario, or Val-d'Or, Quebec, this means something very specific. It means jobs that are insulated from the business cycle. It means wages that are underwritten by defense budgets. It means that when the rest of the country is tightening its belt, your town is hiring. This is the economic shelter, and it is being built for the people who live on top of the minerals NATO needs. And this part isn't a conspiracy. It is a stated policy. The Canadian government has publicly committed to ensuring domestic supply chain resilience for critical minerals essential to national security and allied defense cooperation. That sentence, buried in a policy document, is the blueprint for the next decade. It means that these mines will be built, that the refining capacity will be created, that the jobs will materialize, not because of market forces, but because the government has decided it must happen. But this isn't even the part that scares me, because what we are really talking about is the weaponization of geology, the recognition that in the 21st century, the countries that control the minerals control the future. And Canada, almost by accident of geography, has become the most strategically important piece of real estate in the NATO alliance. We are not just a resource exporter. We are the backup generator for the entire Western military apparatus. Let me show you the mechanism that makes this permanent. The government is not just funding mines. It is creating a critical mineral stockpile. This is a policy imported from the Cold War, when the United States maintained strategic reserves of everything from petroleum to chromium. The concept is simple. The government buys minerals and stores them, ensuring availability during crises. But the effect is profound. It creates guaranteed demand. It means that even if global prices collapse, even if China floods the market with cheap supply to undercut Western producers, the Canadian government will keep buying. This is a price floor, and it makes the sector effectively recession-proof. This is where the countdown quietly began, because the stockpile isn't just about the minerals themselves. It's about sending a signal to investors, to mining companies, to workers. The signal is this: we are committed. We will not let this sector fail. We will not allow market forces to shut down mines that are essential to national security. This is the government putting its balance sheet behind an entire industry, and that changes everything. Here's what that looks like on the ground, in granular detail. A lithium mine in Quebec that was struggling to secure financing in 2023 is now fully funded through a combination of federal loans, provincial grants, and a U.S. Defense Production Act contract. The mine will produce battery-grade lithium carbonate, but the offtake agreement isn't with Tesla or LG Chem. It's with the U.S. Department of Defense, which needs it for next generation battery systems in electric combat vehicles and drones. The contract is for 10 years at a fixed price with automatic renewal clauses. This is not a commodity transaction. This is a strategic partnership. And here is where the first domino falls in a sequence that cannot be stopped. Because once one mine gets this treatment, every other critical mineral project in Canada becomes eligible for the same support. The precedent has been set, the framework exists, and the geopolitical logic that justifies it. The need to break free from Chinese supply chains applies across the board. Cobalt, nickel, graphite, rare earths, uranium. Every single one of these is now on the table for government backing. We haven't even reached the breaking point yet, because what I'm describing is still the early phase. The infrastructure is being built, the contracts are being signed, the first mines are coming online, but the real explosion, the moment when this becomes visible to the broader public, will come in 2026 and 2027 when the production numbers start to hit, when the jobs materialize by the thousands, when entire towns that were dying are suddenly thriving. That's when the rest of the country will look north and realize that a parallel economy has been constructed, one that operates by different rules. This is not a conspiracy. It is a stated policy, and it is accelerating. Let me be precise about where we are in this story, because what we are witnessing is not just an industrial policy shift or a regional development program. We are witnessing the emergence of a two-tiered economy, one where your economic fate is determined not by your skills, not by your education, not by your entrepreneurial spirit, but by whether you live on top of the minerals that NATO needs to fight its next war. This is the convergence, and it is happening right now. Here's the moment the clock actually starts. We are facing three distinct forces hitting simultaneously, and their combined effect is creating what I call the khaki economy, an economy where growth is decoupled from consumer demand and tied instead to military procurement and strategic resource extraction. Force 1, $6.4 billion in Canadian federal investment explicitly designated for critical mineral projects classified as national security infrastructure. This is not economic stimulus in the traditional sense. This is the militarization of mining policy. The money flows regardless of market conditions, regardless of commodity prices, regardless of whether there is a recession or a boom. It flows because the government has determined that these projects must exist. Force 2, U.S. Defense Production Act funding, which gives the Pentagon the authority to directly finance Canadian mining operations deemed essential to American weapons production. This is unprecedented. This is the United States using wartime legal authorities to secure resources from an ally during peacetime. The implications are staggering. It means that Canadian mines are, in effect, being integrated into the U.S. defense industrial base. They are not just suppliers, they are strategic partners in a military supply chain. Force 3, national security regulatory fast tracking, which allows these projects to bypass environmental reviews, consultation processes, and permitting delays that would normally take years or even decades. When a mine is designated as critical to national defense, the normal rules don't apply. The urgency overrides everything else. This is the mechanism hiding in plain sight, the legal framework that allows governments to move at the speed of geopolitics rather than the speed of bureaucracy. This is where the cascade becomes unstoppable, Because when you combine guaranteed funding, guaranteed demand through offtake agreements, and fast-tracked approvals, you create a sector that is functionally immune to economic downturns. Mining has always been cyclical, boom and bust. High prices, everyone invests. Low prices, projects get mothballed, workers get laid off, towns go quiet. But what we are seeing now is the creation of a counter-cyclical mining sector, one that thrives precisely when the rest of the economy is struggling, because its customer is not the market, its customer is the state. And this is where everything changes, because the traditional logic of resource extraction, that you dig up materials, sell them to the highest bidder, and hope the price stays high, no longer applies. The new logic is strategic. You dig up materials that are essential to weapon systems, you sell them to governments at pre-negotiated prices, and you sleep soundly knowing that your contract is guaranteed for the next decade. This is not capitalism. This is central planning with a free market facade. Let me show you what actually happened when this model was first deployed at scale. During World War II, the United States government used the Defense Production Act to convert automobile factories into tank production facilities, to redirect steel output toward warships, to commandeer entire industries for the war effort. The economy didn't collapse, it boomed, because government spending replaced consumer spending, and the wages paid to workers in defense industries allowed them to buy goods and services, which kept the broader economy afloat even as private investment cratered. What we are seeing now is a peacetime version of the same mechanism. The threat is not an invading army. It's the potential cutoff of critical mineral supplies from China. But the response is identical. Mobilize resources, guarantee production, and use government spending to create economic activity that would not otherwise exist. This is the khaki economy, and it is being built in Northern Ontario, in Quebec, in Saskatchewan, in the Northwest Territories. But once this shifts, everything above it starts to shake. Because if mining becomes a strategic sector, if it is insulated from recessions by government contracts, then the regional inequalities that define Canada start to invert. For the last 30 years, the economic center of gravity has been in the cities: Toronto, Vancouver, Montreal. Finance, technology, real estate. The resource towns were seen as relics, places that prospered when commodity prices were high and withered when they fell. But now the resource towns are the safest places to be, because they have what the government needs, and the government will pay. This part isn't theoretical, it's math. Let's run the numbers. A cobalt mine in Northern Ontario employs 500 workers at an average wage of $80,000 per year. That's $40 million in annual wages flowing into a community that might have a total population of 5,000. Those workers spend money on housing, food, transportation, entertainment. They support local businesses. They pay taxes that fund schools and infrastructure. A single mine can revitalize an entire town. And when that mine has a 10-year offtake agreement with the Pentagon, the boom doesn't end. It just continues. Now multiply that across a dozen projects. The Ring of Fire alone, once fully developed, is projected to employ 5,000 people directly and create another 10,000 indirect jobs in transportation, services, and supply chains. The lithium projects in Quebec could add 3,000 jobs. The uranium expansion in Saskatchewan, another 2,000. These are not projections based on market forecasts. These are jobs underwritten by government contracts. They are as close to guaranteed as anything in a market economy can be. And here is where the domino sequence completes. Because as these jobs materialize, as these communities prosper, the rest of the country will be watching. The tech worker in Toronto who just got laid off, the retail manager in Vancouver whose hours have been cut, the restaurant owner in Montreal whose customer traffic has collapsed. They will look north and see towns that are thriving, and they will ask the obvious question, why? And the answer will be clear. Those towns have what the government needs. We don't. This is not a conspiracy, it is a stated policy, but the psychological impact will be profound because what we are witnessing is the return of strategic geography as the primary determinant of economic prosperity. For the last 30 years, we were told that geography didn't matter, that you could work from anywhere, that the economy was global, frictionless, digital. But that was only true in a world of stable supply chains and open trade. In a world of resource nationalism and geopolitical competition, geography is destiny, and Canada's geography is its greatest asset. Let me show you what this means for the average person trying to navigate the next 5 years. If you are in a critical mineral town, or if you can move to one, you are inside the vault. Your job is secure. Your wages will rise. Your property values will climb. The infrastructure around you will improve because the government is pouring money into roads, power, and services. You are in the strategic sector, and the strategic sector is recession proof. But if you are outside that world, if you are in a city, in a service industry, in a sector that depends on consumer spending, you are facing the same economic headwinds that everyone else is facing: inflation, rising interest rates, potential job losses. The difference is that there is no government backstop for you. There is no guaranteed contract. There is no off-take agreement for your labor. You are in the market economy, and the market economy is cruel. This is the binary choice, and it is becoming starker by the day. Do you own assets, or do you own claims on assets? Do you live in a place that the government needs, or a place that the market has forgotten? These are not abstract questions. They are the questions that will determine your economic fate over the next decade. But this isn't even the part that scares me the most, because what we are really talking about is the fracturing of the social contract. The implicit deal that has governed Western democracies for 75 years is that everyone benefits from economic growth, that a rising tide lifts all boats, that we are all in this together. But the khaki economy breaks that deal. It explicitly prioritizes one group, the people who live on top of strategic resources, and leaves everyone else to fend for themselves. And here's where the tension becomes unbearable, because the people who are being left behind will not accept this quietly. They will demand their own government support. They will ask why miners in Timmins get guaranteed jobs while teachers in Toronto face layoffs. They will point out the inequity, and the government's answer will be simple: because we need the minerals, because national security overrides fairness, because in a world of geopolitical competition, strategic value trumps democratic equality. This is where common sense actually becomes your enemy, because the logical response, the one that feels right, is to demand that the government support everyone equally. But the government cannot do that. It does not have infinite resources. It has to make choices, and it is choosing to support the sectors that are essential to national defense. Everything else is secondary. Let's cut through the noise and talk about what this means for your personal strategy. If you are young, mobile, and willing to relocate, the message is clear. Move north. Go to where the mines are being built. Get trained in the trades that support mining: electricians, heavy equipment operators, geologists, engineers. These jobs will be in demand for the next 20 years, and they will be well paid because the government is guaranteeing the industry's survival. If you are older, less mobile, or tied to a specific location, the strategy is different. You need to hedge. You need to own assets that are insulated from the economic cycle. And increasingly, that means owning the resources themselves or owning equity in the companies that extract them. This is not financial advice. I am not a financial advisor, but the logic is straightforward. If the government is backstopping mining, then mining stocks become quasi-government bonds. They offer exposure to a sector that has been deemed too important to fail. But here's the part the experts gloss over. The real opportunity is not in the large established mining companies. They are already priced for this reality. The market knows that Rio Tinto and Glencore and BHP are going to benefit from the critical minerals boom. The real opportunity is in the junior miners, the small companies that have deposits but lack the capital to develop them, because those are the companies that will be acquired, that will receive government funding, that will suddenly go from speculative plays to strategic assets. This is where the asymmetric returns will be. And this is the crack that becomes an earthquake, because as capital flows into the strategic sector, it drains from everywhere else. The venture capital that would have funded tech startups is now funding mining exploration. The institutional money that would have gone into commercial real estate is now going into resource infrastructure. The economy is being rewired in real time, and most people haven't noticed yet. Here's what that looks like on the ground. In 2023, global investment in critical mineral projects was around $40 billion. In 2024, it jumped to $65 billion. The projection for 2025 is $90 billion, and for 2026, over $120 billion. This is not incremental growth. This is exponential acceleration. And the majority of that capital is flowing into jurisdictions that are politically stable and aligned with the West. Canada, Australia, the United States. We are witnessing the largest reallocation of industrial capital in a generation, and it is all flowing toward one goal: breaking the dependency on China. Let me be precise about the timeline. The mines that are being funded today will start producing in 2027 and 2028. The refineries that are being planned will come online in 2029 and 2030. By 2032, the goal is for NATO to have a fully independent supply chain for all 12 critical defense minerals. That is the target, and every policy decision, every investment, every regulatory change is oriented toward hitting that target. This is not theoretical, it's observable. The data forces one conclusion. We are in the early stages of a supercycle, not a commodity supercycle where prices rise because of demand, but a strategic supercycle where production rises because of government mandate. The market is not driving this, the state is, and the state has deeper pockets and a longer time horizon than any private investor. But we haven't even reached the breaking point yet, because what I'm describing is still the build-out phase. The infrastructure is being constructed, the contracts are being signed, the workforce is being trained, but the real moment, the moment when this becomes undeniable, will come when the first major supply disruption hits, when China restricts exports of a critical mineral in response to a geopolitical crisis, when the West realizes viscerally that it was one decision away from losing the ability to produce weapons. That moment is coming, and when it does, the urgency will double, the funding will triple, and the khaki economy will shift from an emerging trend to the dominant reality. Human beings are hardwired to believe that tomorrow will look like yesterday. We extrapolate from the present. We assume continuity. This is normalcy bias, and it is the most dangerous cognitive trap in times of structural change, because the world you knew, the world where resources were commodities, where markets were global, where geography didn't matter, that world is ending. And the world that is replacing it is one where resources are weapons, where supply chains are strategic, and where the countries that control the mines control the future. You become a millionaire on paper, but poorer at the grocery store. This is the money illusion, and it applies here as well, because the wealth that is being created in the strategic sector is real. Those are real jobs, real wages, real prosperity, but it is geographically concentrated. It is limited to the people who are inside the vault. Everyone else is experiencing the illusion of continuity while the ground shifts beneath them. Here is the final resonance, the thing I need you to understand. Gold hedges inflation, real estate hedges currency debasement. But critical minerals hedge war. They hedge the collapse of the old global order and the emergence of a new one defined by strategic competition and resource nationalism. This is not an investment thesis. This is a survival strategy. Because the economy is fracturing and you need to decide which side of the fracture you are on. History favors the prepared, and the window for preparation is closing. The mines are being designated, the contracts are being signed, the infrastructure is being built. And when this becomes obvious to everyone, when the rest of the country looks north and realizes what has been constructed, it will be too late to position yourself. You will either be inside the strategic sector or you will be watching from the outside as it prospers while everything else struggles. This is the transition from illusion to reality, from paper wealth to hard assets, from markets to mandates. The khaki economy is here. The question is whether you see it in time. Friends, thank you for being here today.